Okay, we've completed our list example and we can render multiple components at a time, nesting them inside one another. But let's take a step back and look at our code base. We currently have a single HTML file with about 60-something lines. If we start adding more features in here, things are going to start to get unmanageable pretty quickly. So I think that this is going to be a good time to learn how to refactor our code so that each separate class lives inside of its own file. Separating each component we make into a separate file is a very common way of organizing files in large JavaScript code bases. There's just one little problem here, and that's we need to figure out how to make sure that these individual JavaScript files that contain JSX are going to get compiled into actual JavaScript. In addition, between thumbnail, badge, and thumbnail list, and the code that provides our options down here, we want to be able to include each file as a separate script tag into our actual HTML document. So you can imagine if we split up badge, thumbnail, and thumbnail list all into its own separate files, then we start needing to require each of these different JavaScript files into our HTML document individually. And you could kind of imagine that gets really messy really quickly. For example, I might choose to rename thumbnail to something else, and all of a sudden I need to go back into my HTML document and update all my script tags. And that's not something that's a manual process, and that's not something we really like to do. So what that means is when we separate this out into separate files so that we can organize our code, when we require it back into our index.html file, we want to only include a single file, and that single file will be a concatenated version of all the individual files. So you might say to yourself, well, why are we going to separate it out but then join it all back together, through concatenation? And the answer is that we really want to organize our code base in separate files, but when we go to make use of those in the browser, we want them to be a single file again. So to summarize, we want to achieve the following. First, we want to break our current script tag into multiple JSX files, so this current script tag right here, with all the code inside of it, into separate JSX files. Second, we want to compile each JSX file into JavaScript. So each of these new JS files will include some JSX, and those need to be compiled into JavaScript. Third, we want to combine all these new files into a single JavaScript file. And then fourth, we want to include that into our HTML document as a single script tag up at the top. So before we go any further, I'm going to take a second here. I'm going to tell you that the next few sections here are going to be just a little bit painful. And the reason for that is that we're here to learn about React, but we're going to make a little bit of a detour around React. So please have patience as we walk through the tooling. It's going to feel like we're not learning React, but the tooling that goes around React is absolutely core to using it in production and using it for your own projects. So whenever we talk about using React, many sections ago I said that there are many new tooling and components and concepts, vocabulary that are around React. And so whenever someone tells you that they know React, they don't really just know React.js. They know React and the entire ecosystem around it. So although it's going to feel like we're not making progress into learning React, this is really a necessary and needed step in learning how things work. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Our first step is going to be step number 1, which is to reorganize our components here and break each separate class out into its own file. So that's going to be our step 1. So let's get started. And we're going to do that by copying our thumbnail list project directory. And we're going to rename this one thumbnail gulp. And I'm going to change into gulp, and I'm going to open my code editor. Okay. So now that we have our copy of our project directory, Reminder here that our goal right now is to break each of these files into its own separate, or each of these classes into its own separate file. So we're going to organize all these inside of a new folder. And I'm going to call that folder src for source. Next, each separate component needs its own file. And the kind of the nomenclature we're going to use here is the file is going to be named after the class that it contains. So we'll have badge JSX, thumbnail JSX, thumbnail JSX, and so on. So I'm going to make a total of 4 new files here. Thumbnail JSX, thumbnail list JSX, badge JSX, and finally app JSX. And you might be saying to yourself, well, this doesn't make any sense. We don't have a component called app. That's true. The purpose of app, and we will usually have a file called app, or it might be main or some similar term. And the purpose of that file is to basically bootstrap or do the initial options definition and rendering of our top level component, which in this case is thumbnail list. So the purpose of app is going to be the place where we actually kick off the start of our application. Thumbnail by itself or badge by itself doesn't render itself until we tell it to. And so app is where we kick that process off. Okay. So now we're going to copy paste all the relevant code into each file. So we'll start off with app.jsx. And again, app is going to contain all the options we need to get the rendering process started. So I'm going to select everything from var options all the way through react.render. And I'm not going to include the script tag at the bottom. I'm going to cut. I'm going to go into app.jsx and paste and save. Once this code's in here, I'm just going to go ahead and close the file. Next up is thumbnail list. I'm going to cut, go into thumbnail list, save, close. And then we have thumbnail. I'm going to cut, paste, save. And lastly, badge. Cut, paste, and save. Fantastic. So now all of our code is divided up into separate files. And if you feel as though in the coming sections, well, working with multiple files like this is kind of lame and it's kind of hard to navigate. It's really hard when I have, 4 tabs open here and maybe one sitting over here. It can be kind of hard to navigate through these. And if you feel that way, all I can tell you is that that is not uncommon. Having a bunch of tabs open can get confusing really fast and you can start to get lost in your code. But don't sweat it. It's something that happens to everyone when they get started. And it's solely through working with multiple files that you overcome that challenge. So now that our code is divided up into separated files, we're going to do step 2, which is compiling all of our JSX into JavaScript. To do so, we're going to use a build system called Gulp. Gulp is a Node.js-based tool that is used to automate our build process, which for us, our build process is converting these JSX files into JavaScript and then concatenating them all together. Now, unfortunately, we can't just run Gulp. It's not just something that we install on our machine and then open it through applications or something and then just expect magic to happen. There is a little bit of setup that we need to do, and we're going to walk through all that setup. So the first thing we're going to do to install Gulp is to install another program, unfortunately, called Npm, which is Node Package Manager. Npm is used to install node-based packages. Gulp is a node-based package, so we're going to use Npm to install Gulp. We're going to use Npm to install 2 other packages as well, called Gulp React and Gulp Concat. And you might imagine what those do. The first, Gulp React, is what's going to compile our JSX into JavaScript. And Gulp Concat is what we're going to use to join those converted files together into a single file. So let's get started. We're going to first install Nodejs, which is required to run npm. In my browser, I'm going to go to nodejs.org. And then I'm going to click install. I'm going to keep, and I already have it installed, so I'm not going to install again, but the startup or the installation is very straightforward process. Just go ahead, click the link, and it'll give you a couple steps, and you'll just walk through each of them. Once you have Node installed, we're going to open our terminal back up again. If you already have your terminal installed and you just installed Node for the first time, go ahead and quit your terminal, your console, and then restart it. I use iTerm. If you want to use terminal, absolutely the same thing. Just go ahead and restart it as well. Okay. Now that I'm back in my terminal, I'm going to type node-v, and we should see something that looks like this right here. We should see a version number pop up. If you have a slightly different version number, don't sweat it. Everything is still going to work the same way. Next thing I'm going to do is type npm, and I get some help text about how to use npm. And what this means is that npm was successfully installed. All right, fantastic. We've got Node installed and we've got npm installed. So in the next section, we're going to walk through how to use npm to install Gulp.